All right, you intrepid Herle Burly-ites. We're going to get right to a meaty, just what is going on with the Canadian economy and what the hell do we do about it conversation today. With us for that discussion is one of the smartest people I know, and when you're that, you become a 3-time Herle Burly guest, Jim Stanford. Jim is the founding director of the Center for Future Work, a progressive think tank studying how work is changing in the modern economy, and yes, post-COVID. That seems like an understatement. He's one of this country's best-known economic commentators, quoted frequently in print and broadcast media. He also writes a regular column for the Toronto Star. Here's where we're going with this today. We'll dive into inflation. What's causing it? How serious is it? How do you fight it? The cost of living, related but not the same. How do you help people who need help? What's the level of concern, or should be, about the country's debt and deficit at this point in time? Does this government have a real plan to grow the economy? What are the ramifications of what we know so far of Poilievre's policy? And finally, we'll look at slowing global growth forecasts and what that might mean for Canada. Jim, I want to welcome you back to the Herle Burly. Really glad you're here to help me understand just how terrified I should be by all of this.
Thank you very much, David. I hate it that economics is known as the dismal science, and these days we are pretty dismal. There's no doubt about it.
It is a depressing picture out there. Let's start with what's on everybody's mind, which is inflation and the cost of living and the Bank of Canada and interest rates. And it's becoming controversial as the world appears to be moving into a recession. The Bank of Canada's interest rate policy seems a little bit more controversial. But let's just start. I'm sure you'll have an opinion about this. What is driving inflation in Canada? Because I saw a guy named Trevor Tombe, who's an economist from Alberta, do a study that said that almost all of the inflation in Canada was related to forces outside of Canada, factors outside of Canada. Francis Donald had previously told me the same thing. But the Bank of Canada is talking about increasing domestic inflationary pressures, and that's why they need to continue to raise interest rates. So what is causing this problem, Jim, and how serious a problem is it?
David, there's no doubt that the original inflationary spark, if you like, that started the fire, and this would be going back to mid 2021 and the months after that. There's no doubt that was imported inflation that reflected the very unique tensions and adjustments as the world economy came out of the COVID lockdowns and the various health restrictions. So, and we shouldn't have been surprised by that, frankly. I mean, we experienced a never-seen-before catastrophe, a worldwide pandemic, millions of people dead, incredible, unprecedented restrictions on what we can do. And frankly, we negotiated that incredibly well. I mean, I am still gobsmacked by the fact that the initial downturn in employment and GDP, which was the fastest, sharpest downturn in our history, but it got reversed almost enough to give you whiplash, thanks to some very, very effective policies. One of them, of course, was the health response. You can't have a good economy without healthy people to work in it. And Canada's health response was superior, the second best in the G7, measured by excess deaths per capita. Then we had, of course, incredible income supports, wage subsidies, other fiscal stimulus to protect people, to keep spending power up, to keep people in their homes. Gosh, that's good for the economy. And then we had the Bank of Canada doing some extraordinary things, including quantitative easing for the first time in Canada and other interventions to keep interest rates low and support the recovery. And all of that worked. Oh my gosh. So by, late 2021, we were back to where we were before COVID. We were still below potential, but the rebound was extraordinary. And this will go down in the textbooks, honestly, for decades to come as a remarkable example of effective policymaking and innovation, really. We were making it up as we went along, and by and large, it worked. Then, as we came out of all that, then obviously there's going to be some adjustments and some recalibrations. And one of them obviously was in inflation. So you had supply chains globally that were all screwed up because of transportation restrictions and lockdowns. We still do, frankly. We've still got big lockdowns in China, which are going to affect all kinds of industries and supply chains. We had global transportation interruptions and domestic transportation interruptions. Not all of them because of COVID. We had those floods out here in British Columbia. We've had other things that inhibited how the supply side of the economy functions. From the perspective of consumers, we had an interesting situation where consumer spending power was maintained thanks to those income supplements, the CERB and all the other acronyms that were there. Yet the supply of goods, obviously, for a while was disrupted because of COVID. And then we also had a reorientation of consumer demand because we couldn't travel or eat in restaurants. We ended up buying a heck of a lot of building materials. I don't know if you redid your basement, David, during that time, but millions of Canadians did, and other home electronics, the prices skyrocketed. Motor vehicles, the prices skyrocketed. So then the icing on the cake, of course, was the invasion of Ukraine and then the shock to global energy markets. And the single biggest cause of that inflation over the last year has been energy prices, because we're linked in the way we do our policy in Canada to what happens globally. So those were all the causes. They had nothing to do with Canadian labor markets, with the unemployment rate being too low, with workers being too greedy, with wages being too high. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And the Bank of Canada, in an honest moment, would admit that. But now they're worried that the initial surge in inflation is going to kind of seep through the rest of the economy, including the so-called expectations of Canadians. And they worry that will lock in inflation at high levels, even though many of those initial factors, frankly, are dissipating. We've seen big declines in global commodity prices, even energy prices, shipping costs. Lots of the other initial spurs to inflation are, in fact, dissipating. So I think the bank's wrong in how they're assuming that inflationary expectations are going to get locked in. And I think they're going to do more damage than good with their the medicine they're giving us. I think the medicine, David, could be worse than the original disease.
Well, why is that? What do you see coming? People talking about a recession. Some people say mild in front of it. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it's not mild if you lose your job, that's for sure. And I'm not sure it's going to be short and mild anyways. The Bank of Canada has, after years of being pretty flexible, to tell you the truth, I think that, you have to give them credit for being, a bit open-minded and nuanced in how they've done monetary policy, especially since the global financial crisis in 08, 09. They've tried some different things, and they haven't been narrowly guided by that 2% magic inflation target that is, in theory, their marching order. But now, in the last year, because they're concerned, they've been criticized for being too soft on inflation in the early months after the pandemic, and they're concerned with this locking in of expectations. Now they've rediscovered true religion. They've pulled out the textbook, and they are following it with zeal. And they have said explicitly, David, they're going to get inflation back to 2% no matter what. And that means they will tolerate a recession before, and not just a recession to start and then cut rates. That won't be it. They won't cut rates until they see inflation heading back to that 2% target, and that is a heck of a long way to travel. So my concern is not just that we're heading into a recession. We might already be in one based on the employment numbers. We'll find out, but I suspect that third quarter GDP, that's for the July to September period, that quarter is over, but we won't have the actual data on it until November. I suspect that may well be negative, and that could be the start of the recession has already occurred. And my concern is the bank will not do what a bank normally does during a recession, which is cut rates to stimulate. They'll be more obsessed with getting inflation back to 2% than with getting Canadians back to work. And I think that's a misplaced priority, to be frank.
So we've seen this movie before, right? At the beginning of the 1990s with John Crow, at the beginning of the 1980s with Gerald Bowie at the Bank of Canada. It's the same. They drove the country into a recession with high interest rates and kept it there with high interest rates for a while. But what choice does the bank have if it needs to convince me that if I'm negotiating with my employer for a new contract, that I don't need a 7% raise, I only need a 2% raise?
Yeah, I don't think they can convince you of that, David, and I don't think they should try. And in fact, Tiff Macklem, the governor of the bank, got in some hot water because he literally said that to a group of employers. He's talking to a business group, it was the CFIB, I think, saying don't sign wage contracts at high rates. He's actually talking to businesses that set prices. It's prices that actually make inflation. Why didn't he say, look, business, don't increase your prices by more than 2%. But that's taken for given that businesses can do whatever they want. But it's the workers and the wages that we have to worry about. And I think that's quite unfair. First of all, the workers' share of the economic pie has shrunk dramatically since COVID. Profits have never been higher. Profits have never been higher as a share of GDP than they are right now. And some sectors of business, particularly energy, housing, grocery store chains, and a few others, have never had it better. And instead of looking at those things, we're always looking at the wages. And I think what we've got here is a group of people who have been immersed in the 1970s wage price spiral, and they still have nightmares about it at night. So they see this situation and they say, whatever we do, we can't let the workers increase their wages. It isn't inflationary for workers just to keep up with inflation. That doesn't cause inflation. It literally doesn't. And in fact, because we've got productivity growth occurring, unit labor costs are growing more slowly. So workers and wages have been a restraining, a moderating influence on Canadian inflation. And it doesn't make sense that the focus of policy should be on trying to get workers to accept a permanent reduction in their standard of living, which is what is implied if you say, for a few years, your wages aren't going to keep up with inflation. That's already cut the real purchasing power of wages by about 4% in Canada, and there'll be more to come. Why should you or any other worker talking to your boss say that's fair? It isn't fair. And we have to find another way of bringing inflation down that doesn't impose that permanent cost on people who are the victims of inflation, not the causes of it.
I took those comments by the Bank of Canada as very direct instruction to governments who are negotiating public sector wage contracts.
Well, that's probably part of it, but the public sector in Canada is maybe 20% of total employment. And remember, much of the public sector has had ridiculous authoritarian pay caps imposed on it. Ontario has limited the pay increases already long before COVID, so they started at 1% a year for the last 4 years for nurses, teachers, and other broader public sector workers. So this is a great example.
Well, and it was net zero for a long time before then. Like they haven't had decent wage increases for a long time.
And now the Ford government is actually trying to continue that. Their offers that they're making on healthcare and education bargaining right now are more or less a continuation of the same, and it's even worse because inflation has gotten so much worse in the meantime. So do inflationary expectations explain those wage increases? Of course not. It's the fact that you've got an authoritarian government that's going to dictate pay rather than negotiating it that is suppressing wages. And so that makes it, I think in general, pointing the finger at wages isn't legitimate and it isn't fair. Pointing the finger at public sector wages, given what's happening there, is especially unfair. We had a settlement here in British Columbia with the many of the big public sector contracts provincially just recently, and it was actually quite sensible. It had, modest wage increases, but a built-in cushion, a little bit of extra cost of living cushion, and if inflation turns out to be higher in the future. And I think it was a very well-designed package, and it's one that could be emulated elsewhere. It clearly isn't going to lock in inflation at 7%. It's saying to workers in the public sector, your pay has suffered because of this inflation. We'll take care of you. We'll preserve your real earnings, but we'll do it carefully over time. And I think it was quite prudent. I think it's an example that could be followed elsewhere.
Okay. All right, Jim, I'm going to drag you into politics. The Conservative Party says that inflation in Canada is a consequence of excessive government spending over the Trudeau government's tenure and the facilitation of that spending by the Bank of Canada through bond purchases, etc. And that the solution is to have the bank stop all those practices, which they, I think, have, and secondly, to reduce government spending. What is your response to that policy analysis and prescription?
Yeah, no, that's just driven by the Conservative parties and Mr. Poilievre's strategy in particular to just kind of foment rage and anger at any federal public institution, frankly. And this kind of scattergun anger harvesting approach, I think, is very dangerous to our politics, to our social capital, and to our economy. The claim that our inflation is a result of Trudeau is nonsense, absolute nonsense. Immediately discount that as false information. Inflation in this recovery.
We did spend a staggering amount of money.
Oh, sure we did, and so did the rest of
If I had ever told you in any of our previous discussions that the government would spend $350 billion on income supports in a year, what would you have said?
Yeah, but the thing is, the inflation is global, including from governments that spend a hell of a lot less money. Some of the governments that spend a lot more money, like Japan, has still got 2% inflation. Some of the governments that spent less than Canada, like Germany, have had higher inflation. So the correlation between the spending and inflation is not there, clearly. And yes, we did spend a lot of money to protect people and keep them in their homes and support consumer demand. And that is why we've had this astounding rebound. That's why we're not in a depression. Now, I can assure you, inflation was low in the Depression, okay? In the 1930s, Inflation was not the problem. People were unemployed, people were in poverty, people were homeless, and by the way, prices were falling, not rising. So you can't just say, oh, well, if we hadn't have done the rescue, we wouldn't have inflation today. That's probably true, but that isn't what we wanted. We don't want a depression. The same goes for the claim that the Bank of Canada was the ATM for the government and just printing money. That, first of all, that printing money analogy is utterly false and deliberately inflammatory. That isn't how it actually works, and Mr. Poilievre knows it. But secondly, the bank here did, again, what central banks around the world did, which is to stabilize private financial markets, by the way, banks and other near bank institutions which were panicking and about to collapse. So this was a rescue for the private financial industry, not for the government. Try to keep interest rates low and try to facilitate the spending. All of the things that Mr. Poilievre complains about had stopped at the bank before even Mr. Macklem came into office. Mr. Poilievre's, pledge to fire Mr. Macklem for those mistakes. He's firing the wrong guy. The guy who did them is gone, replaced by Mr. Macklem, and they've been first treading water, but now quantitative tightening. They're pulling back on their ownership of bonds and other financial assets. Same goes for federal fiscal policy. Deeply contractionary right now. The total level of spending is falling dramatically because those COVID-era emergency supports were all time limited and they've all expired. So, if your concern is government spending, then we should be seeing inflation fall right down quickly because government spending is contracting, and Bank of Canada monetary support obviously is now in absolute reverse, foot on the brakes, higher interest rates, but also getting rid of those bonds that it owns. So I don't think that the story is economically legitimate, but it might be politically effective. And here's my big concern. If we end up in a recession, which I think is likely, Mr. Poilievre is out there with a narrative. It's a false narrative, but it's a narrative. And I'm worried that a lot of people, when they lose their jobs, are going to get sucked into that false narrative and say, yeah, they screwed up. Even though what we've done now, I think, is in a way snatching defeat from the jaws of victory of our initial response to the pandemic. But that nuance will get lost in the course of the run up to the next election. So I'm worried that Mr. Poilievre will make a lot of gains if, in fact, we do go into a recession, and that's part of my concern.
There is a common sense element to what he's saying, which is more money out there, chasing more goods. That's what creates inflation. But, what's the counterfactual? Has anybody in economics done any modeling on what our economic situation would be right now had there been no CERB?
Had there been no CERB and no general kind of fiscal response? Absolutely, yeah. People have looked at the impact, the incremental impact of the new spending power that was put in there, and there's no doubt that we would be in a much worse economic position, measured by employment and output and incomes than we are right now. And the both in Canada and internationally, the studies indicate very strong incremental multiplier effects from those fiscal fiscal and other injections. So, and again, this simple storyline, too much money chasing too few goods. That is kind of the knee-jerk slogan about what it causes inflation, and it kind of traces its lineage back to Milton Friedman, that, inflation everywhere and always is a monetary phenomenon. There's just too much money out there, so limit the money and you'll limit inflation. And I mean, of course, we have to have spending power if we're going to pay higher prices for stuff. But just taking away our spending power doesn't necessarily solve the problem. The price of gasoline would still be $2 a liter, even if we didn't have the money to pay for it, given the way our energy markets work. That is not a supply and demand outcome. That is some other kind of outcome. A cartel globally and speculative world futures markets, and an energy policy in Canada that gives the oil companies free rein to do that. That's why the oil companies are making money hand over fist. The price of producing that stuff in Canada hasn't changed, yet the price of gasoline doubled between late 2020 and June of this year. And so that is just an enormous pile of cream going right into the pockets of the oil companies. Taking away our money, would that have changed that? I don't think so. And if it is too much demand and not enough supply, how do we know that the recipe is to cut back demand? That's what the Bank of Canada has decided right now. But our supply, we're still not producing at capacity in Canada. No way. Our real GDP is well below the trend where it should be if the pandemic hadn't happened. And I think the problem with this monetary tightening is it can lock in that position of underutilized capacity. Both human capacity and physical capacity or capital gets written off if it's not being used. So instead of saying there's more demand than supply, so we better suppress demand, why don't we look at the exact places that the inflation came from and where there is a supply problem, and some of them are supply problems for sure, try to address them and stimulate additions to capacity. Right now, we're telling business, don't invest because there's a recession coming. That's exactly the wrong thing to do.
When you've been patient, very patient, because you're in a conversation with a group of people and you have something valuable to add, but you're waiting until precisely that right time. Well, Herle Burly-ites, for our presenting sponsor, TELUS, this is that right time. We've been leading up to something important these last number of weeks with our conversation about the inefficiencies and downright failures of 14 years of the same Canadian spectrum policy. How we're now years behind all other G7 countries in 5G technology adoption because we couldn't auction our available spectrum sooner. And how we could have been way further ahead in reducing our GHG emissions and fighting climate change had we done that. I spoke last week about a special announcement from TELUS. It's a white paper they're publishing on spectrum policy in Canada. More accurately, it's a thoughtful, thoroughly researched examination of the complexities of the issue, over a year in the writing. But it doesn't leave it there. Critically, it presents an opportunity for meaningful reform. Specific ideas and recommendations that will help us auction more spectrum sooner, provide better connectivity for both urban and rural Canadians, lower the cost to provide connectivity, and spur greater competition among carriers, access employment opportunities, healthcare innovation, education, and other public services, catch up and compete in the global innovation economy, not to mention recover economically sooner from the pandemic. I'm only scratching the surface here. TELUS's white paper, Reforming Canadian Spectrum Policy for 5G and Beyond, launches this week, Herle Burly-ites. You'll be able to find it next Tuesday at telus.com/spectrum policy. If I've piqued your curiosity in any way telling this story over the last little while, give it a read. Like anything of value, it was worth waiting for. So I've got polling that tells me that the combination of inflation and rising interest rates is like a pincer move on household budgets. And I've got about 70% of Canadians who tell me that the cost of living is one of their top two issues. I got half of Canadians who tell me they're worse off today than they were 2 years ago. And I've got 24% of Canadians who say that they are concerned about their ability to feed their families. What should the government be doing to help people through this period of high inflation and high interest rates?
Yeah. Now, that's a really, really tricky question, David, all the more so because we've created this Bank of Canada as a so-called independent entity. So the government's immediate capacity to try and bring about a change in direction there is limited, more by politics than by anything else. But nobody wants to touch that by saying, going to the Bank of Canada and saying you're doing this wrong. Even though the federal government signed a new framework agreement with the bank just last year, which clearly says inflation is not the only thing the bank should be concerned about. They talk about maximum sustainable employment as its goal. And, I think a strong argument could be made the Bank of Canada is not respecting that mandate agreement right now. But the reality is politically the government isn't really going to want to touch that. So then you have to have the offsetting measures that the government
since only crazy people want to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada.
Well, I'm not saying anyone has to be fired, but I would like this institution, which is a public institution. It's our bank, by the way, to live up to the instructions and the mandate that our democratic government gave to it. And I'm not convinced that's happening right now. So I think it's fair to criticize the Bank of Canada. I think their reading of the current situation is wrong. Their emphasis on inflation reduction at all costs is not justified. So, that's my 2 bits worth, but it is tricky politically, as we've seen, including with Mr. Poilievre's rampant attacks. So then what is feasible is for the government to take some offsetting measures to try and cushion that blow. And that can include things like what we're already announced. That targeted GST credit made a lot of sense. It wasn't very big, but it'll make a difference. The Canada Housing Benefit that the government announced to help low-income renters was, I thought, a good idea. Again, not very big. And I know Mr. Poilievre sniffed at it, saying, what's $500 for someone paying big city rents? Well, if you're struggling to make ends meet, $500 is a lot. He lives in rent-free accommodation, so maybe he doesn't care.
Right.
But I think there's other things that the government could do to try and protect Canadians, particularly.
What they've done so far, Jim, is small.
Yes.
Right? It's small and targeted. And in part, that's because they don't want to be seen as working against the interests of the Bank of Canada. They don't want to be seen as stoking inflation and spending money while the bank is trying to rein in inflation. But on the other hand, I don't think it was a big enough package politically. I think if you ask Canadians whether the government has done anything to help Canadians through this period of time, people would say no. And secondly, I don't think it reaches nearly enough people that are feeling really, really threatened right now.
No, I agree.
Really stretched right now.
I think your reading on that is right. It's. I think they were good ideas, but I think they were too modest. And this argument that they stoked inflation all depends on your buying the initial storyline that inflation results from too much spending power in Canada. And I don't accept that story. The initial causes of inflation were imported. Those causes, for the most part, are in reverse right now. Inflation is going to come down in the near future. It already is, but the headline inflation is being driven mostly by gasoline prices, and that, I think, you may see a pause in that decline in inflation in the coming months because gasoline prices have gone up again. But the other underlying causes are in reverse. So, to some extent, there's a question here of patience that's required and protecting people while we exert the patience. So, the government was critiqued by some for so-called inflationary measures with those GST credits and housing benefits. They were small and they were targeted. And, in a way, they were just offsetting some of the contractionary impact of the unfair contractionary impact of what the Bank of Canada is doing. Rents in Canada are skyrocketing. High interest rates are supposed to bring down inflation, but rent inflation is accelerating because of high interest rates, because people can't afford to buy a house anymore, so they're renting. And that is a terrible thing. And so to help people with that, for that to be debunked as inflationary, we've really, really lost the forest for the trees there by saying helping people keep their rental accommodation is a problem. We've missed the plot.
Right. So you wouldn't be against further income supports for people that are having trouble making ends meet right now?
No, not at all. And I don't think that would be inflationary because I don't think that domestic demand is the key driver. And here's another thing you can do if you actually were concerned about domestic demand, then take it out the other side of the income ladder. High income earners, and particularly some of the industries that have profited immensely from recent inflation, you could target taxes at those sectors on a temporary basis or even a permanent basis to say, the inflationary impact so far has been very unfair. Some well-off Canadians have profited from inflation. Most Canadians have lost from inflation. So we're going to even out that unfairness a little bit with new taxes like an excess profits tax on the energy industry, which is a no-brainer, and many countries in Europe have already done this, and then distribute the proceeds to people at the bottom so they can meet the necessities of life. And again, meeting the necessities of life is not inflationary.
Is there really room to tax upper incomes more than there is? I got very stern lectures about this because it was my go-to place for revenue when I was trying to advise Kathleen Wynne. And I got very stern lectures from the Ontario finance bureaucrats about tax avoidance and about how we had reached the limits of what we could tax high incomes before they started to circumvent the tax system altogether, the Canadian system altogether.
Gosh, that's first of all, that's a pathetic argument. That's like saying, I'm not gonna make people follow the law, because if I try to make them follow the law, they'll break the law. That is a circular and defeatist attitude, and that suggests to me that some of those senior bureaucrats in Ontario finance have, drunk the Kool-Aid for too long. There is certainly limits to how much you can tax from high-income earners, and Canada's tax system, by global standards, is relatively progressive. So I don't think it's a magic bullet, but the federal government has increased very modestly the upper tax bracket, and I think there's more room that could be done there. But that alone is not going to be the solution, that's for sure.
Right. Just quickly on the country's debt and deficit, because it's sort of popping up as a bit of an issue here and there again. My understanding is that it's dissolving as governments find themselves awash in revenue. Some of it from inflation, some of it from the economic bounce back you're talking about. So, but it doesn't feel like we're going to go back to zero. Right? So what's a reasonable level for us to settle in at annual deficits?
There's a lot happening on the budget deficit thing to explain why it isn't a problem. Your judgment is quite right there, David. First of all, the absolute size of the deficit is shrinking rapidly because of the winding up of those COVID era programs. So actual expenditure has fallen rapidly over the last 2 years. That will reach that will plateau as as those programs are eventually all gone. For example, the special employment insurance access that we had after the CERB was canceled is about to expire. I think we should look at that and we should keep some of that in place. But the reality is we're going to be done with all those programs. So we'll plateau at a lower level of spending. So that's one thing that's happening. Secondly, revenues are growing rapidly, partly because of that fast rebound that we've talked about earlier, and partly because of inflation. There's no doubt about it. Government revenues go up with inflation more so than government expenses go up with inflation. Expenses go up a bit as well, but revenue goes up more. So
nominal GDP is a wonderful thing.
It certainly is for a finance minister, no doubt about it. And then the other benefit of higher nominal GDP, and again, this is partly real growth and partly inflation, is it reduces the relative importance of the debt burden and the debt servicing burden. So for all those reasons, you're seeing a rapid decline in the debt as a share of GDP, and that's going to be consistent with the so-called fiscal guideposts or whatever Chrysler Freeland called them. I forget what her word was. Guardrails. That was it. Fiscal guardrails. She's going to easily exceed those because of that decline in.
I can't remember what it was, but it was debt. Something less than targets.
Yeah, that's right. Guardrails, I think, is the term. Handrail, a walker, a fiscal walker that you can walk down the street with if you need help or whatever. I don't know. But, you know how those folks come up with the terminology and the narratives, David. That used to be your job. But anyways, for all those reasons, it's not a problem. The debt isn't going to disappear. We're not going to pay it off, and nor should we. There's lots of historical experience. We had a huge debt when we finished World War II. And it was a good reason we had that debt, because it helped us defeat fascism. And then it disappeared. And it didn't disappear
For a time.
we didn't. Yeah, for a time we defeated it. It's still out there, isn't it? Then we grew the economy, and the debt disappeared as a concern. And the same thing will happen here if we keep our eyes on the prize. On the other hand, if we go into an interest rate-induced recession, then two things are going to happen. Nominal GDP is going to stop growing, and the interest burden is going to grow a lot. And we could easily get back into the debt. I hate to use the word spiral. It wasn't a spiral, but the situation of rising debts that we experienced in the 90s, which was a direct consequence of the undue monetary tightening that John Crow had implemented early in the 90s, both the high interest rates and the recession and slow growth. And we could have an absolute sequel to that right now if we don't, I think, find a better balance in how we're confronting the current inflation.
So, you spurred a thought in my head, which I thought about at the time, but haven't thought about that much since, which is so maybe modern monetary policy doesn't exist. Maybe money still matters and debt still matters to some degree. But we found in the middle of a crisis, a lot of money to fight COVID. And if we were in a war, we would fight a lot of money to fight a war. What prevents us from finding a lot of money to solve our other, almost equally existential challenges?
Mm-hmm. Nothing. So your point is right. Now, I'll clarify. I'm not an adherent of this modern monetary theory. I think the way that it's expressed is a combination of wrong and sort of trivial. But the core insight that we are not limited by deficits in what we as a society can do is true, and has been true for decades. It was recognized by many economists long before this modern monetary thing came along. So the fundamental reality is we are limited in what we can do by our capacity to work and produce. So once we've actually run out of workers and we literally can't produce anymore, then you can't solve problems by throwing money at it. Until that point, you can. And that is what the pandemic response proved. I think, once and for all, we showed that when there's an urgent social need, government has both the responsibility and the means to meet that need, whether it's a war against fascism or a war against a virus. And we should keep that in mind. So we've a good analogy right now, I think, David, would be climate change and the need to be investing as fast as we can in reducing emissions and positioning ourselves for success in a carbon-free economy. And there'll be huge economic benefits from that down the road. And the idea that we can't afford to do it is nonsense. We absolutely can, particularly given the swaths of money pouring into the coffers of fossil fuel companies right now. So I think the core insight that you've just stated is valid. Now, at some point, we do run out of workers, and we're getting close to full employment. We aren't at full employment, and I absolutely reject the idea that the labor market's overheated, or that it's a problem that there's job vacancies. Everyone points to the job vacancy data and says this is a big problem, and it proves we got to clamp down. Nonsense. It's a good thing that there are job vacancies. That's how a labor market is supposed to work, so that a worker can look around and pick the job that's best for them. And employers have some pressure to make the most that they can out of workers, rather than treating workers as a cheap, disposable input. So, we are not at full employment, but we're getting closer to it. And so there are limits in the end to what we can try to do all at once. But we aren't there yet. And so in the immediate sense, it's a mistake to try and throw an ice bucket over the whole economy out of some false conclusion that the labor market is overheated. That's not the problem. And then secondly, looking longer term forward, we should think about ways that we could try to maintain a very, very high level of employment, a very low level of unemployment, partly because it's great for workers to live in a world like that. I've got young adult kids, David, and the idea that they actually can be a little bit confident of finding a decent job is life altering compared to where we were at a few years ago, where young people thought they would work from one temporary gig to another. And that's something that we should value and preserve and target in our economic policies, not just a certain rate of inflation.
Cool. You mentioned climate change as an area where we might spend a lot of money to get some results. Is it possible that that's not just a good thing to do, but a necessary thing to do? It seems strange. Leaving the environment aside, because I've talked to a lot of environmentalists, business people, and economists about the Biden legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act. And a lot of that bill is about climate. But I don't get the sense that people think it's a game-changing environmental policy. But what everybody thinks it is a game-changing economic policy. That the massive subsidies into new technologies are going to mean that anybody who cares about hydrogen is going to be doing it in the States, not here. Anybody who cares about carbon capture and storage is going to be doing it in the United States, not here. Electrification of all kinds going to be done in the United States because he's made the economics crazy. Do we have to match that?
Yeah, I think we do, and I think we should, even apart from whether Biden was doing it. There's issues around some of those things. The carbon capture and storage issue is very controversial in terms of what it's actually doing. To make it more than just a greenwashing, we'll have to be very careful with that. But economically, there's all kinds of benefits from it, including on the inflation front. If we were further along the path on the renewable energy side of things, then this, OPEC plus invasion of Ukraine, global futures market gyration that has been the largest single force behind the current inflation would be much, much less of an issue. I mean, at the micro level, if you have an electric vehicle, you almost don't care what the price of oil is. And from a macroeconomic perspective, you could have a similar dividend from getting ahead of the curve instead of denying and delaying and deferring, which is what Canada's been doing for the most part. Lots of other benefits in terms of productivity, investment, technology, innovation, from spurring faster investment in those goals. But of course, in Canada, we've still got the politics. We've still got a very powerful, very rich industry out there saying we should keep producing Canadian oil as much as we can because it's somehow ethical to do so, and other self-serving nonsense like that. And that, I think, hampers the forcefulness and consistency of our response.
Well, I don't know who we think is going to react to that. I mean, the markets drive the markets drive most of the money investment in oil and gas, and they're mostly gearing toward A, where they can make the most money most quickly, or B, where it's most sustainable in terms of low emissions over time. Alberta doesn't meet either of those tests.
Yeah. No, it's a nonsensical thing. It will have zero effect, this buy Canadian oil because it's ethical. That isn't how the world oil market works. And it's purely aimed at domestic politics. It isn't aimed at getting people to buy Canadian oil. It's aimed at pressuring Canadian politicians to not do some of these things on climate that we need to do.
As I mentioned last week, our sponsor, CN, is making a coordinated effort to ensure its freight trains leave and arrive on time. You might say, well, duh. But when you're employing dozens of trains simultaneously on thousands of miles of tracks stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and down to the Gulf of Mexico, uniform precision can be a tricky proposition. You have to make sure that any time lost is made up. You have to make sure tracks are cleared so that priority shipments like Canadian grain can roll through unimpeded. You have to coordinate tightly with shippers and with vessels at sea and plan around accurate weather forecasts. It can be like hopscotching while juggling. Well, CN is becoming a better juggler. Punctuality has improved markedly in recent months. More than 90% of trains were departing on time by this past summer. And with punctuality comes results. In September, CN posted a near record amount of grain out of Western Canada. And that was despite forest fires around Jasper and a 2-day washout of the railway's main line that shut down traffic into and out of the Port of Vancouver. I've said this before too. You can cope with nature, you can't manage it. Ultimately, we live in a wintry nation during a time of climate change. Anyway, Canada's grain farmers are feeling the sun on their faces at the moment, and deservedly so. StatsCan's latest prediction is that this year's crop will reach about 75 million tons. And as mentioned earlier, CN is moving it efficiently. Last year, a drought reduced the crop to 49 million tons, and catastrophic weather disrupted shipments. So it's all good at the moment. Yes, as they say on that TV show, winter is coming. But CN is ready. Grain will keep moving till shippers and the markets are satisfied, safely, and yes, on time. Okay, so again, I don't, this is kind of political, but it's really, I'm asking you to focus on the economics of it primarily, which is we're going to have a strong option from the Conservative Party in the next election that looks to me like when you strip away all the things that might distract you, whether it's convoys or vaccines or whatever it might be, looks like an economic message we've heard before. It looks like it's a low tax, smaller government, deregulate business, especially in this case, deregulate environmentally sensitive businesses from the challenges that they have to meet, and the economy will take off. What's true and not true about that?
Well, I mean, first off, David, I've tried to look through Mr. Poilievre's platform, and I wrote about this in the Toronto Star. I'm not convinced that it's actually consistent with that classic kind of neoconservative small government, small tax message. There's a lot of direction and a lot of authority being wielded in there, including, things like the federal government trying to shift domestic municipal zoning laws, for example, as part of the solution to the housing crisis, or some of the other things, even the trivial things like, ensuring that no federal civil servant ever goes to the World Economic Forum meetings and stuff like that. That's smacks more of authoritarianism than libertarianism. So I'm not convinced that his platform is really that coherent. To the extent that there's a small government, small tax, rely on the private sector core there, I'm sure that is the case. Is it going to work? I don't think so. We've got very high corporate profits in Canada. In fact, higher than they have ever been under this, taxing, regulating, dictatorial Trudeau government. Corporations in Canada have never done better relative to GDP than they're doing right now. And the idea that you're somehow going to set fire to the entrepreneurial spirit through tax cuts and so on, I don't think is going to happen. And I think it will set us back in terms of some of the directions for innovation and improvement that we need. The key question, though, in your mind, and I'm sure most people, is it going to resonate politically? Is it going to be a convincing narrative to put to Canadians? And that depends on how Canadians feel. After this horrible, challenging time that we've had, do they think that smaller government is better? If you look around the world and who's done well in responding to COVID, it has not been the places with smaller, weaker government. But that reality could get lost in the fray of the next election. I hope not.
So these guys, Scheer and Poilievre, said they all came of age during Reagan. Mm-hmm. And what are the real lessons from Reagan? Like, I sit around, I hear fucking people like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama talking about what a legend and a icon Ronald Reagan is. I don't have that recollection of it. But people recall that Reagan's economy boomed, that the policies he put in place caused the economy to soar in the United States, especially compared to what was happening in Canada at the time. Is that a true recollection?
Well, the U.S. economy, expanded a lot during Reagan, but it's expanded a lot during other presidencies. I think the Clinton boom was actually bigger and longer in terms of the cumulative growth in GDP that was experienced then. And the Biden boom could be the biggest yet. It depends on what happens with this current slowdown. But the initial years of the Biden administration were very strong. So what caused the boom in Reagan's era? That's pretty clear. It was old-fashioned Keynesianism. Big government deficits. The taxes were cut, but spending was not cut. In fact, spending increased, particularly on military spending. So, if you pump a lot of extra money from the government into the economy, then you'll get a growing economy. That's got very little to do with, capitalism and the virtues of free markets, and a lot to do with government stimulus. And that again was coincident with many of the other structural changes that came about with what we call neoliberalism today, pioneered by Reagan and Paul Volcker at the time at the Fed, and Thatcher in Britain, which is all about dismantling welfare programs, putting unions in a corner, and generally tolerating a much wider gap between the rich and the poor. And I think the consequences of that are being felt in America today. One of the reasons America could not mount a half-assed public health response to COVID was because of the fragmenting of social capital that is the legacy of Reagan's policies. And I don't think that's an exaggeration at all. The fact that people are ignorant and don't trust government and don't trust doctors is an outgrowth of the paralyzing inequality and, in some circles, hopelessness that you see in the United States today. And that is an absolute direct line to the sorts of policies that Reagan put in place.
Right. Okay. Well, that's kind of how I remember it too. There's a lot of trends in American society that trace right back to 1980.
Yes, absolutely.
When I was working with Paul Martin, and people in the Department of Finance would occasionally darkly mutter the word productivity, I would say, shh, never talk about productivity. People don't like hearing about productivity. It either bores them or scares them. One of the two things. It sounds like you want people to work harder for the same amount of money, whatever. But the truth of the matter is, as I understand it, we have an enormous productivity problem. Not only are short-term forecasts for global growth being tapered back, obviously, given the looming potential recession, but when you see long-term forecasts for productivity growth in a place like Canada, it's like zero. And it makes me worry about whether or not we'll be able to afford to be Canada over the long term. And I ask a lot of people whether they see whether this government has an agenda to grow the economy, has a plan to grow the economy, and most people say no. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, first of all, David, I accept that productivity is a major preoccupation, and rightly so. I also accept your point that it has a bad name. People misunderstand what it is, and in part that's because they've been tricked over years. For years and years, said work harder and be more efficient and get rid of some of the fluff, and then you'll be more productive, and then you'll be rewarded for it. The fact is, they weren't rewarded for it, so it was a bit of a con. So I think part of restoring the good name of productivity as an economic goal is going to be to put in place measures that actually ensure that people get to share in the productivity, rather than just holding your breath and waiting for the benefits to trickle down. Canada's productivity performance has been uninspiring, no doubt about it, but I don't think that dismal zero growth forecast makes any sense. Productivity growth has been positive, but slower than it should be. You'll have 101 different theories on why. Mine would emphasize the failure of business investment in machinery, equipment, innovation, R&D in Canada, and that is tied to what I see as the kind of structural deindustrialization of Canada that occurred especially in the 2000s with the big oil boom and the kind of reorientation of our economy, the decline of manufacturing, and so on. I think the business investment performance, even though profits are at record high, is abysmal. Businesses are not investing like they should. We used to care that, or we used to worry that robots were coming to take our jobs. The problem we have in Canada is not nearly enough robots. That is absolutely clear. So does this government have a plan? I think the government has recognized, to its credit, that the role of innovation and technology intensive industries is important. They've put in place this clusters initiative, and they're supporting auto and aerospace and pharmaceuticals and other technology intensive industries. So I think in a way they've stopped the damage, but I don't think we have yet enough of a sort of fulsome, powerful response to it, and I think the Canadian sort of political economy world is still divided on whether that's a good thing or not. There's still powerful sources that say, no, we're doing fine. Let's continue to rely on resource extraction and export, finance, and real estate development. That's been our big industry policy winner. Unbelievable, in 2021, for the first time ever, Canada's economy invested more in residential construction than in all other forms of investment put together. So,
but this is the end of the world, right? I mean, this is. If you pick up a big tome that says "How Societies Decline," that's going to be in there.
Right. Yeah, that's true. When you stop thinking about innovation and ideas and machinery and production and start, building monster homes and luxury condos for your vocation, then you're right. The end is near. So we need to somehow, a combination of public and private investment, get more emphasis on the innovation potential of new industries. And that will be, I think, the key ingredient in improving productivity growth longer run. Keeping the labor market tight is another important factor. For years, employers knew there was a pool of ready, desperate workers out there who could be called in on short notice. You didn't have to invest in training. You didn't have to invest in apprenticeships. You didn't have to really treat people that well. Just, when you needed them, hire them. When you don't need them, get rid of them. That was kind of a convenient way of managing labor for years and years. When the labor market is tight, you can't do that anymore. And you have to, in a way, treat workers with the value and respect that they deserve, including retention, lifelong career opportunities, training, and other measures that enhance productivity. And I think there's some evidence already, even only after a year or so of tight labor markets, from OECD countries, that this is a boost to productivity growth. Keeping the labor market as tight as you can actually forces employers to make more out of the labor they have, and that is exactly what productivity is.
But isn't that in conflict with rising immigration levels?
I think rising immigration levels would be, that's a kind of a safety valve. Employers have been asking for that. Instead of trying to invest in more robots and other labor-saving technology, they say, please open the doors again and let us import as much immigrant labor as we can. Immigration in general is very good for Canada, but that temporary migrant labor that these businesses want is a disaster. And it's just an easy out for them to solve their labor problems without getting innovative. And that's exactly what we don't want.
All right. Well, I cannot let somebody who works at an institution called the Future of Work leave without answering this profound question, which may or may not be of some interest to me. Are white-collar workers going back to the office at some point?
I think so, David. Obviously, there's a difference of views among workers. Some actually like to go to the office. I'm one of them. But most clearly don't. Most would rather stay home, partly to avoid the commute and partly so they can watch Netflix and have a nap at lunch. Most employers clearly want workers back in the office, in part to have a closer eye on them and supervision. They dress it all up in words like, well, we need the teamwork and the interaction and so on. What they really mean is, I want you here so I can see what you're doing. And so I think there's going to be, it's going to be contested for a while. But I do think the realities of fragmented at-home work in most occupations is subpar. And I think for the most part, we are going to go back to the office. Remember, too, this whole debate about whether you work at home or work at the office is a subset of the overall labor market. It's only maybe 30% of Canadian workers who have that choice. Most workers have to go to the place of work for all kinds of different reasons. So to some extent, I think this work from home versus go back to the office bit it gets a bit too much attention, in part because the people who can do that are the opinion leaders who get to mouth off in public life, rather than the Tim Hortons workers or manufacturing workers or healthcare workers who have no choice but to go to their regular place of work.
It started to feel to me like it might be just another weird schism in our society between people that are doing well and people that aren't doing as well. Everything, there's a priority line for everything now, and now you don't even have to go to work, right? And if I had to go to a workplace, if I was a construction worker, I would resent the shit out of that, I think.
No, you're absolutely right. It is a schism, and it's a schism that was built on another schism. I mean, the reality is not all, but most of the people who could work at home were, by and large, people in various professional, managerial roles who were already better paid than the rest of society, already had better benefits than the rest of society, and now on top of that, got to keep their jobs, no income losses, and do it from the comfort of their own home. So there absolutely is I wouldn't quite call it a class division, because the people doing this work at home are still workers, but it's another dimension of inequality, and it made it all the more unfair for people who didn't have that option to work from home and preserve their jobs and income during the pandemic, who actually had to stop work. Luckily, well, not just luck, but good judgment. We had the CERB and other benefits to help take care of them. But now, now they're being told that they're coddled, they got too much, they caused inflation, and they have to get back to work. And I think that's a kind of a blame the victim thing. I think one thing we learned in the pandemic was that all of the work that these people do is essential services. It's not just healthcare and emergency responders, it's grocery store clerks and delivery drivers and carers and cleaners who got people through the pandemic. And, for a while we gave them $2 an hour extra, and then we ripped it away. Now, I think we should go back and say, wait a minute, if these people are in fact heroes, we should treat them like heroes and give them $2 permanently.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's anything that we should have been learning from what we've been observing in the States and around Europe and laterally in our own country, it's that we need to pay more attention to social cohesion.
Yes.
And what pulls us together and what makes people think that we have something to do with each other. Because the thing's starting to fragment in all kinds of different directions.
You're 100% right, David. This idea, some economists call it social capital or cohesion or trust, was absolutely vital. You cannot combat a pandemic without it. And the clear distinction between Canada and America on that score is all the proof you need. And the people in Canada who want to get rid of that, who challenge it with the divisiveness and so-called individualism that we're hearing from some quarters, and be more like America, are dragging us down. Absolutely, it's a big fear for me.
Jim, it's always a super pleasure to have you on. Thank you for taking the time to do this. Really interesting conversation. I had a great time.
Thank you, David. So did I, and thank you for pushing the envelope in all the discussions that you lead in our society. Thank you.
Well, thanks. We'll try to get some ideas out there. Thank you to everybody who watched or listened today, and thank you to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. Take care. Next week, we'll be back with more Herle Burly. And special thanks to our guest today, Jim Stanford.
Herle Burly.